Today we're going to solve quadratic equations by using a quadratic formula. Remember, we've already solved quadratic equations using two other ways. One way was the square root method, which is like example 1. We use this one when there is no x term. To use the square root method, you are going to need to isolate the squared term. So I subtracted 8 from both sides. I can't subtract. Divide by 2, which gives me x squared equals 49. So then I'm going to take the square root of both sides. And remember, when you take the square root of both sides, you put plus or minus in your answer, and you get x equals plus or minus 7. The square root of x squared is x, so you always want to end up with x equals something. The second way we've solved quadratic equations is by factoring. So I'm going to factor number 2. Before you factor, it has to be equal to 0. When you factor, you're going to look at the first term and your last term. So x squared splits up x and x, and you want to multiply to give you 5 and add to give you 6. So I'm going to use 5 and 1. Once you get it factored, you can set each factor equal to 0. And then you solve for x to get your final answer. So you get x equals -5 and x equals -1. So those are the methods that we used so far. Now we're going to learn a new method. The new method is used when you can't factor or you can't isolate the x squared term and take the square root of both sides. The new method is we use what's called the quadratic formula to solve, and the quadratic formula is x equals -b, and negative means the opposite. So if b is 7, you're going to put a -7 here. If b is 6, you're going to put a -6 here. But if b is -8, then you would put a +8 here. Plus or minus always is going to be involved in your quadratic formula because you want to get two answers. The square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2 times a. Now to determine a, b, and c, you are going to use a quadratic equation. A is in front of the x squared, b is the number in front of the x, and c is the constant. So a is the number in front of the x squared, b is the number in front of x, and c is the constant. You can only use the quadratic formula after you have set your equation equal to 0. I'm going to show you 6 examples using the quadratic formula. Some of you might understand how to do this after watching 2 examples, maybe 3 examples. Others might need to watch all 6. So take notes as needed here. You cannot solve these problems until your equation is set equal to 0. So that's the first thing you have to check. After you set it, make sure it's set equal to 0, you're going to find a, which is the number in front of the x squared, b, which is the number in front of the x, including the sign, and c, which is your constant. So it goes A, B, C in alphabetical order, and the constant you're going to include your sign also. Now the quadratic formula, again, is x equals the opposite of b is 2 plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. Now we're going to have to work this out, and we're going to use our calculator to do a lot of this. What I want you guys to do is, using your calculator, I want you to type in this whole entire thing to your calculator exactly like you see it here. So you're going to hit your square root button first, and you're going to get a value for what I have in the rectangle. So I'm going to write 2 plus or minus. I'm going to type in the square root of -2 close parentheses, squared, minus 4, open parentheses, 1, close parentheses, open parentheses, negative 5, close parentheses. Now some of you, when you do this, when you hit your square root button, it's automatically going to put a parenthesis right here. So what that means is you're going to have to double up the parenthesis so that you can put negative 2 inside the parentheses. We always need to have an even number of parentheses. So if your button on your calculator starts a parenthesis when you hit the square root button, then you're going to type it in like you see here and make sure you have all the parentheses in the exact same spot. If you have done this right, then you should have gotten for your answer the square root of 24. And actually, on your calculator, you should have gotten a decimal. So if you did this right, you should have gotten 4.9. Now what you're going to have to do, because the plus or minus means you have two answers that you have to write here, is you're going to have to split this up, and you're going to have to do 2 plus 4.9 on your calculator divided by 2. Then you're going to have to do 2 minus 4.9 on your calculator divided by 2. When you do this, you have to add the 2 and the 4.9 before you divide by 2, and you have to subtract 2 minus 4.9 before you divide by 2. So you need to plug into your calculator exactly like you see it on the screen with the parentheses. So parentheses, 2 plus 4.9, close parentheses, divided by 2, and that should give you 3.45. So try this on your calculator and pause the recording so you can make sure you're doing this right. And then the next one's going to be parentheses 2 minus 4.9, close parentheses, divided by 2. If you're typing this into your calculator, you get negative 1.45. It's super important that you guys learn how to plug this into your calculator right now. So if you have any questions, make sure you email me so that we can make sure you're doing this right. Okay, let's go on to number 4. Number 4 is already set equal to 0. So what we're going to do is we're going to identify the a, which is the number in front of the x squared. B is the number in front of the x, including the sign. And c is the constant, including the sign. Once you set this up, you can go right to your quadratic formula. X equals the opposite of b, which is positive 2, plus or minus the square root of. Now remember, when some of you hit your square root button, it's going to open a parenthesis already. So you're going to do b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. So again, I want you guys to type into your calculator this in its entirety before you do anything else. If you've done that right, you're going to get 2 plus or minus. It should be the square root of 36, which is 6. So you probably won't see the square root of 36. You're going to see 2 plus or minus 6 on your paper. That's what you should write down. So this equals 6. So that's what you're checking to make sure that you've done the correct stuff on your calculator. So in the last problem, we got a decimal when we typed that into our calculator. In this problem, we did not get a decimal. So you got to realize sometimes you do and sometimes you don't. So now we're going to break this up into two answers, and we do 2 plus 6 divided by 2, and then we do x equals 2 minus 6 divided by 2. Again, put your numerator in its own set of parentheses so you do order of operations the right way. 2 plus 6 is 8. 8 divided by 2 is 4. 2 minus 6 is negative 4, and negative 4 divided by 2 is negative 2. You don't have to do those individually. You can type it into your calculator exactly like you see it on the screen. Number 5, we have to set equal to 0 before we start. So we're going to have to add 6x to both sides. So those cancel. And we're going to have to subtract 3 from both sides. So those cancel. So we have x squared plus 6x minus 3 equals 0. So when we identify our a, b, and c, a is still 1 because there's a 1 in front of the x squared. B is positive 6. And c is negative 3. So typing this into the quadratic formula, or writing it, I guess, x equals the opposite of b is negative 6 plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac. And then we remember you're going to open parentheses when you hit your square root button. You're going to close parentheses here. All over 2 times a. Well, let me erase a because we know a equals 1. So again, I want you guys to type into your calculator what you see here first. So you're going to type that in. You get negative 6 plus or minus. And on this particular problem, when you do that, you should get 6.9 divided by 2. So type in everything that you see in that rectangle exactly like you see it in the rectangle. Now we're going to have to break this up into 2 separate problems. And we get x equals negative 6 plus 6.9 divided by 2. And x equals negative 6 minus 6.9 divided by 2. And again, since we have to follow order of operations in math, when you type these into your calculator, you have to put the numerator in its own set of parentheses before you divide. If you've done this correctly, you should get x equals 0.45 for the first answer, and x equals negative 6.45 for the second answer. Remember, pause this video if you need to review the explanation. On number 6, you have to set it equal to 0 first. So again, I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides. So I get 16x squared minus 6x minus 4 equals 0. And on this one, these are pretty big numbers. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to take out a 2. If I divide all of these by 2, then I can work with some smaller numbers. So if I do that, I get 8x squared minus 3x minus 2 equals 0. Then if I were to divide both sides by 2, this 2 is going to disappear. And that leaves me with 8x squared minus 3x minus 2 equals 0. And I can get my a, b, and c from there. In this problem, a is 8, b is negative 3, and c is negative 2. Don't forget to take your signs with you as you're defining a, b, and c. So x equals the opposite of b is positive 3, plus or minus the square root of b squared would be negative 3 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 8, times c, which is negative 2, all over 2 times a. So again, make sure that you have included this parenthesis and this parenthesis to open and close underneath the square root. Type in what you see here first, exactly like you see it on my screen. And you're going to get x equals 3 plus or minus. When you take the square root of all of that, you guys should be getting 8.5 divided by 16. So we're going to split this up into 2 answers. So we get x equals 3 plus 8.5 divided by 16, which gives us x equals 0.72 if you've done this right. And then you get x equals 3 minus 8.5 divided by 16, which is negative 0.34. Number 7 is similar to what we've been doing. We have to set it equal to 0 before we start. So we're going to subtract 20 from both sides. That gives us x squared plus 4x minus 20 equals 0. Now sometimes you might check to see if this factors. Other times you might say, hey, I don't remember how to factor and I don't want to take the time to try this. So I'm just going to go ahead and go straight to my quadratic formula, which means a is 1, b is 4, and c is negative 20. And I type it in as x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2 times a. If you're typing this into your calculator, you got to put those parentheses. And you're going to type this into your calculator first. So please, that's the most important step, that you know how to get the square root of 4 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 20 on your calculator to be 9.8. If you're not getting that, you have to email me or get in for some extra help. So once you get that, you break it up into 2 separate problems. We have negative 4 plus 9.8 divided by 2 and negative 4 minus 9.8 divided by 2. We got to follow order of operations, so we've got to type that into our calculator all at once, and you should be getting x equals 2.9 and x equals negative 6.9. So the reason why we use the quadratic formula is so you can solve quadratics without having to take the time to factor or use the square root method. But you can't do this if it has parentheses like number 8 or if it's not set equal to 0. So on number 8, you're going to have to start out by distributing. So we get 8x squared plus 4x equals 5. Now you got to subtract 5, so you have 8x squared plus 4x minus 5 equals 0. Now you're going to define your a, your b, and your c. A is the number in front of the x squared, b is the number in front of x, and c is the constant, but you got to pay attention to those signs in front so that you write it out as needed. So the quadratic formula is x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. So again, you got to have those parentheses in your problem, and you're going to type this into your calculator first to make sure that you are getting the right decimal. When you type that into your calculator, you should get 13.3, and then we're dividing by 16. So now we split this up into our 2 separate problems. X equals negative 4 plus 13.3 divided by 16, and x equals negative 4 minus 13.3 divided by 16. Got to type in the numerator first and then divide by 16. If you do this the right way, you guys should be getting 0.58 for this answer. And then over here you get negative 1.08. Now apply this to your homework, and when you do this, make sure everything's set equal to 0 before you start using the quadratic formula. You should try and memorize the quadratic formula, but I will give it to you on your next quiz if you don't have it memorized.